I began working with kids in 2002. I worked with kids with severe behavioral problems in the school, in the communities. I would go into low income areas and work with families. I would do family therapy, I would do individual therapy out in the homes and also in the schools. From there, I began to extend into working with adults and working with older population, doing relationship, marriage counseling. And then in 2013, I decided to start my own practice. And once you open your own practice, you kind of treat everybody that walks through the door within your skill set. And as the longer you do it, you just get better at working with a bigger population. Whereas when I used to work at different facilities, they would sort of put you in a category, so you would just get all kids. But when you do private practice, people are calling all the time and they need help, and that's what I'm here to do. So you work with a bigger group population. I think your skill set expands quickly when you're doing private practice. ADHD usually presents itself sometimes 3 to 4 years old in kids. You can see they're very hyperactive. They can't focus. They're all over the place. A lot of times it's treated with medication. I try to do a non-medication approach to ADHD. Typically, teachers will call the parents and they start to notice that there's some kind of issue. So they say maybe you should go get an evaluation and see what's going on. So with ADHD, part of it is impulse control. So we teach kids, sometimes adults, to control their impulses a little bit better and not to just react in situations. Sometimes ADHD will lead to bipolar symptoms older in life. Bipolar is a cycle of emotions from really, really high to really, really low. When they're up, they tend to make some fairly bad decisions, and that's what usually leads them to my office. When they're really, really down in the depressed state of bipolar, also they can make bad decisions in that time period too. I feel like ADHD and bipolar are related because a lot of the same techniques that work for ADHD work for bipolar in adults. You just adjust them for kids, and then you have to adjust the treatment for bipolar to adults. So the first thing I try to do is get them on some consistent, stable routine. Sleep's thrown off, oftentimes with ADHD and oftentimes with bipolar too. Most of us are on a 24-hour cycle where we sleep 7, 8 hours a night. We get up in the morning, we have our day. People with bipolar, their circadian rhythm is thrown off, so they may be on a 48-hour or a 72-hour cycle. So they'll sleep every 2 days, every 3 days. This causes a variety of problems because they're not rested. And whenever they're really, really up, they become irritable, anxious, angry, impulsive, and then it complicates it further because sometimes they start using substances to chemically modify how they are, their actions. So when they do that, they get into addictive things. And then once you get into the addiction, you have to treat the addiction first. But I feel like ADHD and bipolar are pretty related. But the idea of it is to maintain the impulses, to be consistent, to have a routine. A lot of times they can't drink caffeine, particularly after 2 o'clock, because it gets them really worked up. It can trigger a manic episode. A manic episode is being really, really high, where the decreased need for sleep, making impulsive decisions, spending sprees, and a variety of other things that can lead to problems in their life. To teach a kid to control their impulses is very difficult. It starts with the parents come in and I try to figure out, is the parenting going the way it should? Are these kids in situations that maybe are contributing to some of the ADHD symptoms? If you have a parent coming in and they're not very available emotionally and the kid's acting out to gain attention, then it becomes more of a parenting issue and a family therapy issue. So we have to determine early on what's actually the real problem. If it's ADHD, then we can work on specifically treating that. But we also have to work on the environment. That's what's the difference between an LCSW, a social worker like me, because we look at more the environment and also how they interact with their environment. ADHD is a variety of symptoms, hyperactivity, and attention deficit. So they're unable to focus on what the task is at hand. So if they have a very simple technique, you'll look around and the other kids are sitting and focusing, and you have one kid that's getting up and he's walking around and he's not paying attention and he's talking out and he's talking out before he raises his hand. Sometimes the teachers will notice that, and when they do that, they may send them for a referral for an evaluation. If I have the kid come in, and I know what natural kids do, they're very energetic and they move around a lot, but ADHD is above and beyond that to the point where they can't really retain information. and they start having academic problems as a result and behavioral problems outside of the norm. That's where we differentiate true ADHD from just kids being kids. So there's a variety of treatments for that. One of the first one I do is just getting them into a consistent routine with their parents. Sometimes their parents are letting them drink Mountain Dew or eating sugar, or their parents are not being terribly nice to them. So if that's the case, then we have to work on some parenting skills. The parents have to be consistent, and they have to have a consistent routine that the kids know what to expect. So if we handle all the environmental factors and their kids are still having problems with focus and they're having grades dropping outside of their peers, I mean, if the whole class is out of control, then that's a different question. That's more a question for the teacher. But we can usually tell if the kids are having more problems than just their peers. The teachers, again, they're good referral sources. They'll call the guidance counselor, and the guidance counselor will work with them. Sometimes people try the medication route. I personally try to avoid that if I can. It works with some kids, there's no doubt about it. But I always try to talk stuff first. You try to work on impulse control and then being able to contain themselves a little bit more. I have a very simple technique. I just have kids say what they're going to do before they do it. They come into my office. I say what you're going to do and then do it. Don't just do it. That gets them to start thinking ahead of their action, because they're just going nonstop and it's really hard to calm them down. It's really hard to calm them down in my office sometimes. So we'll do play therapy. I'll let them get kind of the bugs out, and then I wait for an opportunity to find a teachable moment, we call it. So if we're doing sand therapy, or we're just playing with Legos or playing with blocks, and I'll just start talking to them, and usually they'll be able to open up. And more often than not, we find a variety of situations that are contributing to it. For instance, trauma, if dad's not around, parents separating, those types of things can lead to ADHD symptoms. And then you start thinking, okay, is it trauma or is it ADHD? With bipolar, you come into my office, we figure out what's going on, what are your triggers for either a manic or a depressive episode. When we find out what the triggers are, we start to work on those and talk about those. If we find that your sleep schedule is really off, we try to get a routine, consistent sleep schedule, because sleep, I feel like, is one of the most important things. We got to get that on track first. As soon as we get to sleep and we get your sleep going and we just stabilize, then we'll move on into different techniques. Sometimes the bipolar is related to, it seems like, traumatic issues from the past. I tend to go that route. Also, genetic issues, family, mother or father has bipolar. There's a much higher chance for the kid to have bipolar. Sisters, cousins, brothers, if it's in the family, it tends to be not just within the family and the genetics, but then it's also in the environment too. So if you have two parents with bipolar and you grew up in a house with two bipolar parents, the chances of you having bipolar are very, very high. It's hard because I don't think many people that have it want to necessarily admit it, because it is something that's usually lifelong. If there's a more mild form, which would be bipolar type 2, it's a lot more treatable. Sometimes we can do that without medications. But typically, if it's a bipolar type 1, there's usually medications as one of the most successful ways to treat it, unfortunately.